Part of the first decision making was how to lay this out. I considered a number of formats, including a manuscript book and a triptych, but then decided on something entirely different. Something that struck me was the non-traditional, almost casual voice of the poetry. Very non-traditional, and so I did not want to use a traditional alphabet. I developed an alphabet that is a kind of uncial that's italicized and pressurized for this. I felt it appropriate for reflecting the tone, the tenor of the voice. Because this dealt with Ithaca, both a real physical locale and a very mythological locale, I wanted to have something, a paper, a background that reflected, suggested automatically a kind of primitive or mythological background. And so I was using this very difficult to write on fig bark paper. I'll talk more about that. But I wanted to practice doing the lettering on this first, just to see what it would take. And I'll explain to you what it did take in terms of materials and techniques. I also wanted to begin working with some color and some potential letter forms for the title. For the title, I wanted to create a set of letter forms that were very primitive, almost primitive Grecian letters. And so I experimented a lot with those. I experimented a lot with the letter forms of the title and the coloring and the gilding, reflecting the richness mentioned in the poem. And I came to the conclusion that they were just too circusy. I decided against them after all the trial and error. Here are just a few of the materials I used at different intersections of making the piece. I wanted to give myself opportunity to feel at ease in writing out all these letter forms and the poetry itself. And so I lined up an alternative piece of paper that I knew was not as challenging to write on, but similar in color. Worked out everything, used a special pencil to do the lining and the numbering of the lines so that I would not make mistakes writing out the different lines of the poem. Then continuing to write it out and practice it more and more until I built up confidence to actually write on the real paper. This is the most primitive paper in the world. It's made by Indians in Central America. They cut off strips about an inch wide from off the fig bark tree, the bark of the fig tree, and then they soak it for several weeks in water and potash. They take it out and they align them one next to the other on a wooden board and then mallet it out so they felt together. So it's not a true paper. It's not made into pulp and then made but instead it's this very turbulent, primitive looking thing. And so it has a lot of potential and a lot of drawbacks. One of the drawbacks that it has is that when you hold it up to the light, you can actually see pinholes through the paper itself. And so if I tried to write on it, it wouldn't be possible because the ink would be going through the back of the paper. You would get no consistency of lettering whatsoever. So I had to do something about that. I took a second piece of the same type of paper and double taped it to the back of a rigid board. I was going to then saturate the back of that with a fluid called acrylic matte medium. And it's a gelatinous liquid that would seal it off. Once I had this saturated and put it under weight on the back side of the paper I was actually going to be writing upon and left it there for a week. At this point, the two pieces of paper were fused together and would allow me to then turn over that paper and write on the front. With the possibility of some clean, crisp writing on the front if I went one step further. And that one step further was to seal off the front side of the actual paper that I would be writing on with a sizing material called ethylose. And it's designed to really seal off any kind of a porous surface. It's archival, and I used 3 different layers of it, letting it dry in between each layer. Knowing that even though the paper was taped down, it still would buckle somewhat because of the saturation of the liquid. And after the final 3rd layer of ethylose, I would put that under weight, knowing that it still wouldn't be consistently flat. But it would be flat enough to work with, and I was confident that I could actually write on it without things bleeding out or feathering out. So I was ready to actually begin thinking about lettering on this surface. So now I could actually begin making the lines. And there were 54 lines worth of lettering there. And I could begin doing the lettering. I actually did the lettering with a pen that I had to actually modify and make myself, but it was perfect for the purpose. It was flexible, and it would allow for the special type of white writing fluid, a Dr. Martin's bleed-proof white, that I was using to do the lettering, which had excellent saturation. And here are a few views of the columns of writing, both the first and the second, and close-ups, the first column and the second column. And backing away, seeing that both columns written out. And I had totally reworked a few times the lettering style of the title that I wanted, that I thought would work better. And I knew this was going to be gilded, and in a special way that I'll take you through in just a moment here. In working out the gilding for the title, I wanted it to reflect the kind of references to the exotic bazaars and pleasure to the senses and rich fabrics that were suggested all within different parts of it. And so I wanted to do the gilding in such a way that it would be very prominent, and I was experimenting with embossing into the gilding, which is kind of dangerous. And so in this particular workup, I was showing myself how it would look either embossed or not embossed in the different parts of it. Also, later on, I had to develop a special way of making those straight lines with a ruling pen on the surface of the paper that was extremely uneven. I'll show you that in a little while. Something I learned that was very important from Donald Jackson was when you're working on a large piece, you really want to mask off most all of it because you do not want to dribble. Also, you have the opportunity, if you have your papers there, to make notes on it of what you did, when you did it, so that it's really important to register the intervals between laying certain bases, gold, lettering, etc. I'm at the point now where I have laid 9 layers of the gilding base to make it raised and smooth so that I can actually do the embossing or tooling into this base, and hopefully it will be successful. It needs to be raised enough to be seen. A little bit of a close-up of the gilded, not gilded yet, but the laid gilding base, very raised, very smooth, and then also in the next part of it as well. Having the humidity in the room amped up enough so that the gold will actually stick is very problematic in the winter months. And so in my studio, I could no longer get it to anything more than 23%, and 50% is optimal. So took the piece up into the bathroom, shut the door, turned on the hot shower, and got the humidity up over 50% so I could begin the gilding in the bathroom. So here's the gold leaf sticking to the gilding base before it's cleaned up. And here are the letter forms with the gold leaf on them that after they've been cleaned up with some of the tools of the trade there beneath. And this is what it looks like at this point with the writing and the gilding and none of the guidelines erased yet. And here is the ruler that I customized. It had to be raised enough so that it wouldn't bleed under the edges. So I raised it with a no-skid shelf liner connected with double stick tape. And it did the job to make those lines and not bleed under the edges. And talking about erasing lines, you get a lot of shredding of the eraser, and this particular eraser is just excellent for erasing lines, but there was not enough binder in the white paint, and so a lot of the white paint smeared away and chipped off. So I had to come back and I touched up every single letter with a extremely small pointed brush to make everything opaque and clean. And here we have the gilding and the lettering and almost everything ready to go. I still have to put the little dots in the margins and the gilding and also tool into the gilding, but everything's been touched up and clean. I'm setting up the model now on the workup as to how I want the placement to be and the embossing to look like for the gilding. I wanted the texture, the embossing and the gilding to suggest the rich, exotic, incense-laden air and bizarre uh, mentioned in the poetry. I kept thinking of thick, textured, romantic fabrics that someone of high standing might have worn to tool into the gilding. And here's the side-by-side workup with the final and a close-up of the gilding over the first column and the gilding over the second column. And now a view of the entire finished piece and the same finished piece against a really beautiful textured black background that I will present to you when we see it together, which I hope you'll be able to appreciate all the more when you see it up close in person. Thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity to create this piece. Lots of struggle, but lots of satisfaction in the doing. I appreciate it.